Hello, welcome to Citizens for Global Solutions Minnesota. I'm Katia. Citizens for Global Solutions Minnesota is a nonprofit organization based in the state of Minnesota in the United States. Every third Thursday of every month, we host one of our online projects. Today, we're hosting the Human Rights Forum, where we will discuss climate loss and damage at COP27. This event is free and open to anyone. If you want to learn more about CGS Minnesota work, please visit our website, globalsolutionsmn.org, and follow us on Twitter and Facebook pages. Our Facebook page is Global Solutions MN, and our Twitter is CGS_MN. And of course, we do have our YouTube channel. It's CGS-MN altogether. Ladies and gentlemen, to speak with us tonight, we invited and are honored to host our guest speaker, J. Drake Hamilton. J. Drake Hamilton is Fresh Energy's Senior Director of Science Policy and an expert in climate and energy policy and at the state and national levels. Her responsibilities include policy development of renewable energy solutions to global warming that will maximize economic opportunities. Jay represents Fresh Energy at the UNFCCC Climate Summits. In November 2022, she showcased Minnesota's nation-leading deep carbon reductions on the global stage at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. Jay earned undergraduate and graduate degrees from Dartmouth College and the University of Minnesota in physical geography with emphasis on climatology, energy, and water resources. Hamilton serves on the advisory board of the Irving Institute for Energy and Society at Dartmouth College. She was named by Minneapolis-St. Paul magazine as one of the 100 Minnesotans who make things happen. Jay, welcome. The floor is all yours.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you, Katja. Thank you to Nancy for inviting me. I'm really waiting for your questions. I'm going to speak for about half an hour with some impressions of what has happened on climate change. And mostly I'm going to leave about 45 minutes for our discussion. I would tell you this was the 8th time in November 2022 that I went to a conference of the parties hosted by the United Nations, the 8th. I went to my first in 2005. This was the first conference I'd been to in Africa. And I thought, okay, we're going to the right place where the people are suffering the most from climate change. Africa, in fact, is the home to 17 of the world's most climate vulnerable countries. And if you don't know it, you should, that the global warming emissions emitted by the world, 3.8% of them have come from Africa, 3.8. 78% of them have come from the G20 most wealthy countries. So that's a big disparity. So I was eager to be back in Africa too, because many years ago, I spent 4 months there when I was in college. And I lived with local families for 4 months. And I had the privilege of living with, maybe some of you are familiar with the journalist who passed away about 1.5 years ago, Hilary Ngueno. He was the best journalist in Africa at the time. And he was an amazing man. And I got the privilege to eat dinner with him and his family and breakfast with him and his family almost every single day. And I learned a lot from him. So I'm going to start from a big view Then I'm going to go down into some places within Sharm el-Sheikh. And it was known when we were there as Sharm because it's a resort in a very dry place that gets 0.03 inches of rain a year. So you know that it doesn't really belong there, right? So most of the parties to the COP, and the parties, just to make sure everyone's on the same page, the parties are the countries that have signed the underlying treaty. Most parties, as I understand it, had low expectations going into the conference that was called COP27. And partly this was because there was simultaneously global combined energy, food, and debt crises underway. And of course, war in the Ukraine and many other places. And at the same time, the G20 were meeting in Asia. I think that no other COP has had lower expectations in 30 years. And to my dismay in Egypt, the Egyptian presidency of the COP did not drive ambition. Most of the people I've talked to think this was the least well-organized COP that they'd ever seen before. And that was my impression too. But we nonetheless had very high impact decisions made. And one of these was the climate loss and damage funding. Back in 2005, when I started going to COPs, people from the world's most vulnerable nations had been at the conference, and they'd been urging the United Nations to address the issue of loss and damage. It's really true that there were people from these very small and very poor countries who had made it their way to these conferences. And they said wealthy people must take responsibility for the people injured and the property damaged by climate change. They pointed out, when I was back there in 2005, they said, loss and damage is irreversible, climate-related devastation that cannot be mitigated or adapted to. So these people were hit first and are being hit first and worst by climate change and are least equipped to respond. But can you believe it? In 2022 in Egypt, loss and damages was added for the first time for discussion on the UN agenda on the first day of the COP. And that was on November 6th. And no one at that time who was at the conference with me thought that they would actually take action on loss and damage, because they never had in the previous 30 years. So it was remarkable. We expected some amount of limited but insufficient action on emissions and some conspicuous and maddening lack of action on climate justice, climate finance, and especially loss and damage. Instead, we got basically the opposite. The parties reached consensus during the 2 weeks and about 2 days on establishing a loss and damage fund after vulnerable people had urged it for 30 years. They had the first ever historic finance discussion, and I got to hear some of that. It is important for you to know that several parties, several countries played crucial roles. The European Union, Canada, and New Zealand especially moved forward to establish loss and damage funding, and they successfully isolated the United States. And they convinced our lead negotiator, John Kerry, who I know, to change his mind. And the US came in agreement with other parties. So, yet this is still the first year of this loss and damage, and many critical questions have yet to be answered. Where do the funds come from? How many funds will there be? Where does loss and damage funding stand in the bigger architecture of global funding. Who is the funding base, for example? Does it include China, who is arguing, maybe successfully, maybe not, that they are still a developing nation? So I want to talk to you with more details about this fund and what we need to get out of it. But first, I want to say very specifically to the United Nations, the United Nations in this conference makes its decisions. The parties make their decisions only if they meet consensus. So in this year at Sharm el-Sheikh, there were 26,370 delegates. Most of them were people like me, observers, and they came from 195 countries. So if you can imagine trying to get consensus when any one country can say, nope, that is not going in the document, you can see how short some of the pacts that come out of these COPs are. I was in last year in Glasgow, and that pact was very successful, but it was only 11 pages, but it was 11 pages single-spaced. This year, the pact is about 9 to 10 pages because the Egyptians were not helping us. So a new fund that's been created will support impoverished communities vulnerable to climate change. That's part of the good news. We need to determine how they will access the climate fund. So it's been under negotiation since 1991, and the fund's primary purpose is to provide financial assistance to developing countries vulnerable and suffering from the adverse effects of climate change, such as destruction of physical and social infrastructure. The new funding arrangements will, quote, focus on addressing loss and damage by providing and assisting in mobilizing new and additional resources. And I'll tell you in a few minutes how much resources it is thought will be needed, and it's vast. Now that a decision to establish the fund has been made, the question of how vulnerable groups and countries can access the money must be addressed next. People who live in developing countries, most of whom are already climate refugees, are particularly vulnerable here. Those who live below the poverty line often reside in precarious housing, haphazard settlements, underserviced neighborhoods, and environmentally hazardous locations, such as steep slopes on riverbanks and in low-lying areas, all at risk. For example, the 2022 flood in Pakistan caused damages and economic losses of about US $30 billion. In addition, people in developing countries are affected by slow onset processes. Slow onset such as sea level rise and non-economic losses and damages, such as the loss of their territory, particularly if they live on small islands, the loss of cultural heritage, their sense of place, and the loss of indigenous knowledge. So I was looking first and talking a lot when I was in Egypt to people from small island states, because I know they had started out this thought of urging the UN to open up loss and damage funding. So 39 countries known as AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States, are these initiators, people that are particularly vulnerable to the ravages of climate change. And a lot of the first people in around 1991 were from the islands like Vanuatu, Marshall Islands, and Palau, which are all in the Southwest Pacific Ocean. Tiny Vanuatu nailed the climate conversation at the UN. In 1991, the small island nation of Vanuatu, now just over 300,000 people, raised a question on the global stage that rich nations have been avoiding ever since the Egypt discussions. Who should pay for climate catastrophe? At the time, Vanuatu, on behalf of an alliance of small island states, argued quite reasonably that polluters should pay for the cost of their pollution. It was an urgent question. Vanuatu has had remarkable foresight for doing that. And their territory is now very threatened as global temperature increases, contributed to rising sea levels worldwide. Indeed, entire nations could be lost if fossil fuel pollution continues unabated. There should be, in fact, and I'm quoting them, quote, an insurance pool used to compensate the most vulnerable small island and low-lying coastal developing countries for loss and damage resulting from sea level rise. More than 30 years later, this issue of irreversible loss and damage from the climate crisis is said to be one of the central issues as diplomats and world leaders convene at COP28 in the United Arab Emirates. And this starts on the last day of November this year. So after decades of deflection, it is overdue for high polluting countries like the United States to take this question seriously. The truth is that as long as humans have been burning fossil fuels, we've been making the world more dangerous. We now see clearly that the climate crisis is supercharging extreme worldwide weather. The deadly floods in Pakistan are one example, but there are many, many others, especially in Africa. There can be no justice without action on loss and damages. Arguments against action have taken many forms over the decades. The most laughable in retrospect is that this was a problem for the future rather than in the present. When I was in Egypt in 2022, I saw calamitous rainfall in Cairo that I thought when I was in my taxi going across the city, rain came out of nowhere and the highway was not designed for that. And I held my husband's hand tightly because I thought we would have to leave the taxi and make our way somehow back to our hotel. And then several weeks later, we were in Petra, Jordan, just a couple weeks before they also had calamitous rainfall. But while we were still there, we saw what we would call, as being Americans, many of us, we would call it a cloudburst. But we got about 2 inches of rain in Petra overnight one night. And my husband kept getting up to look and see if rain was getting in. So it's really here right now. So a climate fund was born. It still doesn't have any money in it yet. All right, so people were celebrating, and they should celebrate. But then the surprise agreement came up. And the absence of any financial commitments since then is raising concerns in developing countries that the fund could fail to deliver the historic help that was promised by world leaders. That's largely because the agreement left more questions than it answered, including where the money will come from. Will it be resourced in the coming year, in 2023? Will it be resourced in 2024? And a climate finance expert at the International Institute for the Environment and Development says, what we are getting is a pittance now. A handful of countries, including Denmark, Austria, and New Zealand, committed around $80 million towards supporting what's known as loss and damage before that fund was created. But much of that money is earmarked and won't help fill a dedicated fund that countries are hoping will steer billions of dollars to things like damage or the loss of cultural heritage. So what we're looking at now is an empty shell. And I'll explain to you how the UN intends to fill that shell. The agreement calls for a dedicated fund to pay for loss and damages. They have to determine what types of loss and damage will the fund cover and who will be eligible, what countries will be eligible and expected to donate money and which will be eligible to receive the money. If we don't have resources in the fund, then it will be just another empty shell. So what the UN has devised with the parties in Egypt is there is being developed a transitional committee responsible for the operationalization of the new funding arrangements. And its deliberation ought to focus, I think, on making financing inclusive. Flexible finance governance architecture, such as database tracking, social protection of vulnerable populations in each country, could mitigate inequalities. Protective measures could ensure that the money reaches even those communities who lack internet connections and the expertise required to make requests. For example, social security numbers, if they exist, bank accounts, and smart mobile technologies could be linked to enable direct benefit transfers, similar to the system used in India to provide support during the COVID-19 pandemic. Contingency funds should be established to provide rapid financial support to the affected groups in the immediate aftermath of future disasters. The Loss and Damage Fund should also include long-term financing to support alternative climate resilient livelihoods. This provision could help address financing gaps in the case of slow onset events and non-economic loss. So what is this transition committee? It will include 24 members. They are now being appointed by the UN. They are going to be, I'll tell you what countries they're coming from in just a little while. I'll read to you what the document says. They have to bring proposals to the rest of the parties at COP28, starting on November 30th. In the United Arab Emirates, which has its difficulties, 10 of the 24 seats will go to developed countries and 14 seats to developing countries. And they're always broken down by geography and by types of economies. The committee will need to ensure that the fund can find money without siphoning funding away from other pots of finance dedicated already to humanitarian aid or efforts to cut emissions and shore up climate resilience. It will also need to avoid the pitfalls of other UN funds, say experts. The design issues are really, really key and they don't have much time. Now this transitional committee must meet for the first time before March 31. And then they will need to meet an additional 2 more times before the COP. And they have a lot of work to do. Let's see, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. They will also need to understand how are you going to mobilize substantial resources for loss and damage in a way that doesn't cannibalize from mitigation and adaptation. And think of us as the US. We and most of the wealthy countries haven't yet our promise to the world that by 2020, we would start providing $100 billion a year about other funding. And we are not up to that yet. And will the fund offer aid in the form of grants and loans or some other forms of financial assistance? For example, like insurance. So for example, there's been some ideas that were discussed also in Egypt. The Barbados Prime Minister, Mia Mottley, came to Egypt, and she had outlined the Bridgetown Initiative to overhaul the global financial system. A loss and damage fund is one of the Bridgetown Initiative's 5 priorities. The loss and damage fund could be seeded with money from a levy on fossil fuel production, including windfall levies to fossil fuel companies. It could come from taxes on methane emissions or a tariff on carbon in traded goods. These are all under discussion. Now, some countries are taking action on their own, but really the UN has to do their job. And the UN's loss and damage fund needs to avoid needing to constantly rely on the goodwill of some funders. It will be much more desirable to have a predictable source of funding that countries can tap into. So ultimately, the litmus test of a fair and just loss and damage fund will be whether it serves those who need it the most. And the people who will next see that produced plan, that proposed plan, will be at COP28. All right. So I think I've been talking for almost 30 minutes, and I'd like to take some time and see what questions you're having. And maybe Katja and Nancy can help me see what the questions are.
Thank you so much, Jane. It's amazing. It's so much information that you're bringing to us. And I will start bringing to you some questions that we have from the audience. The first one is from Gail, and she's asking, where in Africa did you live?
I was in Kenya. We were not allowed to go into Tanzania because the year I flew to Kenya, there had just been a coup attempt in Kenya, and that had resulted in the deaths of many medical students in Kenya. And they had closed the border between Kenya and Tanzania. So we were only in Kenya. I was there for 4 months. I lived half the time with my family, the Ngwenos, in Nairobi. And it was interesting because I was there with 20 other students from Dartmouth. And in comparing notes with the other students' families, mine was very low middle class compared to all of them. They mostly lived in the suburbs. We lived in Nairobi. And the other half of our time, we moved around the country and we lived with local families. We lived with a local pastoral family and with a local agricultural family. And it was amazing. And I'm so proud of what has happened to my host family, the Ngwenos in Nairobi, because at the time that I was there, they have 2 daughters. One daughter was a junior in high school, and she was fascinating to be around, even though I was 20, she was just 16. Her older sister was at Harvard. And I didn't get to meet her, although I talked with her on the phone. After she graduated from Harvard, you know what Amalo did? When she was at Harvard, she lived in housing with other East African women. And what they spent most of their time doing at college was talking to one another and planning for how they could make the most impact for Africa. And then a few years after they graduated, they all came back to Africa, and 4 of them decided that what that part of Africa needed the most was access to the internet. And that's what they did. They made hundreds of millions of dollars, and they gave it all away. And they brought the internet to East Africa. So that is what I watched or knew the early beginnings of. And that's where I was. And I'm so proud that when I looked at the data for Kenya, when I went there in 1983, the doubling rate The fastest doubling rate in the world was in Kenya. They were growing at 4.1% per year. Now it is much, much less. But it's still a much more populous country than it was before. Any other questions?
Thank you for that. Yes, Dick is asking, please comment about your positive, hopeful signs that you see among we the people.
We the people in the US you're talking about? From that we the people? Or from people in general? Dick.
Dick, do you want to elaborate?
Yeah, in general, in general.
Well, it comes from I tend to be an optimistic person anyway, which doesn't mean that I don't have my bad stretches of time. I've been working on climate change for now almost 30 years with Fresh Energy. So I've seen big ups and very big downs. But, you know, it really surprised me when I learned, after I'd grown up as a very introverted person and a very shy person, and I liked my own company, but I was very clear from the time I was about 17 or 18 that my favorite things in the world are not things at all. They are all people. I see some of this on my screen. It is people that give me so much hope. And it's always been that way for me. And it led me to, in my work, it was interesting because I wound up giving like 50 presentations a year. And now I've talked to something like a couple 100,000 Minnesotans about climate change, always about climate change. And I've spoken in every city and even every moderate-sized town in Minnesota, except one in the far northwestern corner. I've never spoken in Crookston, Minnesota. But what I found is that I was really good with a lot of preparation to succinctly and clearly make points about climate change and climate action needed. And I've established a great deal of credibility around the state, and that's important to me. But what I always learn from everywhere I go is talking to the local people, because just asking them open-ended questions about how they live their lives reveals so many brilliant, fantastic, artistic, creative people. And it is mind-boggling. It is so wonderful. And I really believe that where we can work together to solve the climate problem, it still won't be easy. But one of the basic underpinnings is to be able to talk to more people who were not raised as you were and who live in different parts of the world. And so that's one of the things I like about going to COP meetings, because I'm a person who likes to keep lists to remind myself of things I'll forget. And I keep a book, and it just allows me to jot down when I'm on a bus somewhere or on a train somewhere, who was the last 6 people I met and what did I learn from them? And it grows into pages and pages. And I always tell people who are there, and people from Minnesota who are coming with me, to not spend all your time with other people from Minnesota. Spend time with people from countries you've never met before. And I counted the number of people I talked to, really detailed talks with people in Egypt. And I talked with people that I'd never met anyone before from these 27 countries. And I now consider them friends and hope I will continue to build on those friendships. But I found amazing information and amazing ideas in their heads. I hear them come out of their face, and it made me think we should put more of these people together. We get better answers.
It's wonderful. We have another question, comes from Gail Hughes. Warfare is probably the biggest contributor to climate damage and environmental destruction.
Mm.
Was there any attention to reducing arms, especially nuclear types, which could destroy the planet in an instant?
Yes, I heard many people talking about those ideas, all of those ideas and more. This was not on the official agenda of the UN. But the thing is that the more people there are around, and this was a place that had 26,375 people around, they want to talk about many other things too. And it was interesting because here in the official pact that came out of Sharm el-Sheikh, it actually encourages all parties. And this is something that many of these observers had always talked about in Sharm el-Sheikh. We saw the UN in the pact, so this was a consensus thing, and it encouraged parties to, well, first of all, thanked the parties who had brought or helped to bring large civic delegations of people from their countries that included lots of young people and lots of people who couldn't afford to go otherwise. It thanked the people for that. And then it said, parties should consider opening up their official delegations, people who were members of their parties, to open it up to youth. And in fact, one good thing that Egypt did at this COP was COP27 had a youth Egyptian woman who was representing the youth of Egypt. And that was the first time I'd ever seen that done at a COP. And more of that will happen, I think, because there are many outcries and many really sober rationalizations from many young people who, it turns out, have just as many bright people among youth as we have in the world. And there's a lot of us. So we need to be hearing from people from all the generations.
We have another question from Judy Jones. Are you going to COP28?
Yes, and because I've never been to the United Arab Emirates. I've never been really in a petro state, unless you consider, of course, the US is a petro state, but a petro state in the Middle East. And I am wanting to see, because, you know, just because we were in the Middle East, in Egypt, and there were the most people there who were registered for COP27 were from the United Arab Emirates. There were over 1,000 of them. And we think this is because, although they share some likelihoods with Egypt, the United Arab Emirates feels really they are already on under a microscope. And they knew what was going on in Egypt because many people were very dissatisfied with how poorly Egypt was running that COP. And it was really awfully run. I would talk about it, but I would have to go on for a long time. So the UAE knows their reputation around the world. And That reputation came under a lot of blows in the last week when the UN has appointed the person to be the president of the COP28. And his name is Dr. Sultan Al Jaber. And he lives in Abu Dhabi. And he is the CEO of the largest state-owned oil company. And he is already starting to plan his presidency from an office in his oil company. So many people have expressed their opinions about this, but in reality, I think in a petrostate like UAE, you need to have those people in the room helping to make the decisions. Because remember, the UN focuses and does their work through only consensus. So I agree with John Kerry, who is, I hope, still leading the delegation in UAE, that he thought this was a good sign. Because if we're going to get to a point, hopefully at COP28, where we actually do what India asked the rest of the world to do. India asked people to do in Egypt. And they said, we should not be focusing on just phasing out coal. We need to also phase out quickly all fossil fuels. So coal, fossil gas, and oil. So it's going to be a fascinating place to be. And the reason I brought up the number of people from UAE who were at COP27, they were sent there by their country. And they were sent there to figure out why some things weren't working and what would work better in the UAE. Because they know people are going to expect much more from the UAE. After we'll be in Dubai. And we're not in a backwater place. We'll be expecting them to do a much better job than Egypt did. And part of that job is going to be having the first ever really focused discussion among the parties about how to get off fossil fuels and do that in a country that sells a lot of them. And we're hoping we will have help from India, because India this same year during the COP will be hosting the G20, India. So they should be making outcries to the world from G20 that India will need to get behind moving off of fossil fuels too. And we hope that the UAE will be having more discussions with Egypt to get them to support moving away from fossil fuels. Everyone's going to need to get off fossil fuels. The fossil fuel industry is feasting. This is a quote from Antonio Guterres, who is the UN Secretary General. And he said this in September 2022. He proposed a tax on fossil fuel profits to pay for loss and damages, among other things. He said, quote, "The fossil fuel industry is feasting on hundreds of billions of dollars in subsidies and windfall profits while household budgets shrink and our planet burns. I am calling on all developed economies to tax the windfall profits of fossil fuel companies. Those funds should be redirected in two ways," he said, "to countries suffering loss and damage caused by the climate crisis, and funds also to people struggling with rising food and energy prices around the world." So this is now close to being on the agenda for the UN, and I'm looking forward to that. The other thing I'm really looking forward to about going to UAE is this year shall be the first ever, since the Paris Agreement was passed in 2015, it's the first ever global stock taking for the world. And what that means in UN is to see how well we're doing on meeting the items of our Paris Agreement? And I know what the answer is now, not very well. And that means we will make it incumbent on the parties there that we all agree to do much more. And that's what I'll be there to see. And I've been able to get into the global stocktake in Glasgow. I was there, and that was really for discussion purposes. And they had 1,000 people in the room. 950 of them were parties and were delegations. The people in the front were like 20 people from the UN. They heard from everyone in the room, not me. But I was sitting there writing down notes and recording what people said. And that's what I will be doing again, and bring it back to Minnesota and the US so people know what people seem to be agreeing on. And now we just need a little more diplomacy to carry us through. I should also mention that I've been extraordinarily lucky. I've been now to 7 COPs. And I don't know exactly why this is, but I have been able in every COP, including my first one, to get invited always to meet with the head US delegation diplomat. And always I meet with them. We're like 12 people in a very small room. And 6 of those people are American citizens, including me. And an equal number of people from our official US delegation. And every time I've met with John Kerry, since he's been the official delegate, led the special presidential envoy for the president on climate. And so the reason I go to those meetings is because every single time the diplomats, want to hear what we're seeing in our country and what we think we need. And they're also answering every question we ask. And for most of those answers, and we always ask this in the meeting, and I would say 97 or 98% of what we hear from our diplomats, we are allowed to tell people. So I have always just run with that. And last year when I came back from Glasgow, I did events like this to 20 audiences. And each time I told them what John Kerry was most concerned about and most hopeful about, and how he was doing it. So if you want to ask me about that, please go ahead. But he is really an extraordinary diplomat. And he just turned 79. So please, and I constantly tell to the younger people I know, we don't just need young people. We need people from every generation with different skills and different knowledge and different credibility to the wide range of people in the world. And we need that. And that gets back to what was a really, first it was a devastating realization to me when I realized I really liked people more than I thought I did. And I love spending time with people, all kinds of people. And I think more people should do that. And they should be seeking out people who don't come from the very base that we all came. Well, we all came from different bases. And so seek out people who came with different ideas and live in different countries and live in a different economic bracket than you do.
Wonderful. We have several questions. Virgil asked, what should be done at Minnesota state level to address climate change? Is there a specific legislation that we should support?
Yes, the 100% campaign at the Minnesota legislature. Fresh Energy is working with hundreds of other nonprofits and businesses throughout Minnesota. And there are bills now moving in the Minnesota legislature. Can you believe it? They are called in the House of Representatives, its number is House 7. And it has a low number because it's a high priority. In the Senate, it's called Senate 4. And this is calling for Minnesota to require all utilities to get to having 100% carbon-free electricity by 2040, with benchmarks along the way. There's high benchmarks for 2030 and 2035 and 2040. The first bill passed the first committee in the House last night. And this committee is run by Representative Patty Acom. She's the chair. She's from Minnetonka, and she shepherded through. And its next stop in the House will be on the floor of the House. Meanwhile, of Monday next week, Monday, January 23rd, the identical bill, which is Senate 4, will be held in the Senate Energy and Utilities Committee. And that will, we think it will get out of that committee and then we'll go to the floor of the Senate. And we think that in the short time, and we know that this is a top priority of our governor and the majorities in both the Minnesota House and the Minnesota Senate, we think that this bill will be signed into law in the next weeks or maybe a month. And it's called the 100% Energy Campaign, carbon-free energy. And if you go, after we leave tonight, if you go tonight or tomorrow, check out the Fresh Energy website, because that will have on its front page all about the 100% clean, carbon-free electricity bill by 2040. Fresh Energy's website is at fresh-energy.org. And I'm going to give you, and hopefully CGS will also send you my email. If you think of a question after we end tonight, or if you want to invite me somewhere else to be with people or to do it virtually like this, my email is hamilton@fresh-energy.org. And I respond to all my emails, not necessarily instantaneously, but I love to talk more with you or find out what more you need to know. But this will be the biggest carbon bill to ever pass in Minnesota. And it will mean that we started a long time ago working on the electric sector, and Fresh Energy was very involved in this. And we had lots of partners and lots of many conversations with a lot of people and bonded together on what we agreed on for like 87% of what we agreed on. If you have 87% agreement with your core values with many other people, you can move things. And we moved first with the electric sector, and we found that now we're going to need to electrify every other sector. Because what we need to do to achieve President Biden's goal is that for the United States, and he has committed this to the rest of the world. He was there. I got to be in the room with him with 5,000 other people in Egypt, and he said it again. The goal is for the US to cut emissions by 50% by 2030. To do that, and we're a very big carbon emitting state in Minnesota, we have to electrify more of everything. And there's still very hard things to do. Like, how are we going to reduce aviation carbon? And how are we going to make green steel? We use a lot of steel. We also use a lot of concrete. We need to make them both green. Those are the hardest things to do. But we need to start with doing what President Biden has done for all of us. And it was done by my former senator, because I grew up in New York State. Our senior senator is Chuck Schumer. You know what he was doing during July and August of 2022? When everyone thought Biden's goal of trying to get Congress to pass what is now called the Inflation Reduction Act, which really highlights climate change and will provide money from the federal government for many purchases of things that will grow clean energy jobs in your state, cut your investments in energy with federal help, and help you if you're thinking about eventually buying an electric vehicle, that can help you with that too. And it can help you weatherize your home. It can do many things, and the money doesn't go away. This is a large investment that's been made, and it will exist for at least 11 years. So you don't have to make any of these decisions in the next week, but you need to start planning what you might improve in your own life and in your own company's life. And you should always think about the highest lever you have to pull, because chances are it's not just your home. It's maybe how to improve your suburb and make them go faster to moving away from fossil fuels. So you can also talk with me anytime about the Inflation Reduction Act, because we think it's the best policy in the world. And I heard from a lot of people when I was in Egypt who are from the European Union, and they said, you know, when President Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act, oh, and by the way, I forgot to tell you what my former senator, Chuck Schumer, was doing in the summer of 2022, when everyone else had given up on the Senate doing anything, because they were looking at a prominent Democratic senator named Joe Manchin from West Virginia. And they thought he had really tightened the lid on the Senate and that it would never move. But here is what those two were doing. They were every day holding secret meetings in the basement of the Capitol complex. They were able to get away with it because they had great staff people who allowed them to go in closets nearby and to talk, to really speak about what they both agreed on. And they rewrote the Inflation Reduction Act. The person who started writing it was our junior senator from Minnesota, Tina Smith. And they improved her bill. And the amazing thing is, on August 16th, 2022, this bill passed both houses and went to the president and got signed. So that also gives me great deal, Dick, to your question of, you know, where do I get my feelings of hope from people? It comes from Senator Chuck Schumer and Senator Joe Manchin working together in secret and coming up with a better bill that, if it is moved forward and if people start taking advantage of that money, making those investments, then this will not quite take us to 50% reduction in emissions by 2030, but will get us to 40% emissions reductions by 2030. And that is why states will also come into play. And that is why we're moving so hard to move Minnesota very far ahead on this 100% carbon-free electricity by 2040. Because states, including Minnesota, are going to have to help from the bottom up to get President Biden to his goal for all America. So it's never been a more exciting time to work on this. And that's what I bring to young people too, because I tell them the truth. There is nothing in climate science that says that humans will go extinct because of climate change. It is not going to happen, and that's good news. But when we have a lot of people of a lot of generations working in America to bring us, hopefully in a few weeks, 100% carbon-free electricity in Minnesota. And meanwhile, when we had so much help from the US Senate to work secretly in the basement to get this, they've committed now more than $500 billion that is going to come to Americans to help them improve their businesses, improve their towns, and make them all environmentally just. So it's a sparkling time. And in Egypt and again in United Arab Emirates later this year, there will be a lot of people who want to talk to me and others like me from America, because the people who came to me from the European Union, they said, we have had to totally rethink when we saw that President Biden had signed the Inflation Reduction Act. And we are going to invest more money in electric vehicle production in the United States. And we are going to think about what's in the Inflation Reduction Act and what we can adopt here in our countries. So that's important too, because finally, the US had some things really big and very positive. And in the case of the Infrastructure Act that preceded the Inflation Reduction Act, the infrastructure bill, which is also very important for solving climate change, that was a bipartisan bill. And no one had thought we would ever see that coming out of politicians. So people should reflect on what has changed. And these have been very significant changes. This is really going to be changing for everyone in America in a very positive way. But we need to get the word out more about it.
Okay, next question is from Elaine. What is the most critical or urgent way individuals can work to make a difference on climate change? It's kind of what we were talking before.
Well, anything you do can be helpful. And there are many ways to be helpful because there's so much carbon going into the air. It comes from every sector. So small things help, interim things help, big things help. But I think right now, the federal government has handed us a huge gift to solving climate change. And we need to get familiar with this Inflation Reduction Act. And we need to think about how we can use it at the scale and pace that we need. But as well, because many of us think of ourselves, for people on this screen who are Minnesotans, you should make sure Minnesota, in our case, should pass the 100% carbon-free electricity by 2040 bill. House File 7, Senate File 4, and we should encourage people who live in less progressive states to understand that the Inflation Reduction Act will also improve their lives. Because this is money that's available to anyone in the US. There's even a section of it, thanks to Senator Tina Smith, that focuses on rural America. So everyone can benefit from this, and everyone should take a part in it. Because if you don't even care about climate, but if you care about, hopefully everyone cares about building the number of clean jobs that are available to the kids coming up after us, that's a win. That's a win for everyone. And this bill will do that. And if you want to reduce air pollution and you want to save money to heat and cool your home, this will help you do that. It'll even help you drive an electric vehicle sometime in the near future. That means you do not ever have to stop at a gas station again. Think how good that would feel. So there's a lot we need to get doing. And I would say that the one thing that the EU climate chief, whose name is Frans Timmermans, said about the COP27, he said, the headline would be, COP27 achieves the bare minimum. We made a breakthrough on loss and damage, but what we have in front of us, when we tally it up, the emissions reductions, it is not enough of a step forward for people and the planet. And he said, in COP27, we should have done much more. He was right, and we need to make that different out of COP28 and all the other places decisions are being made. Because not all climate decisions are made at the COPs. Many decisions are made in your town, your city, your suburb, your rural area, at your work, your workplace, and by your state government. So there are lots of places where we can work to be very, very effective. Any more questions?
Yes, next question is from Nancy, and she's going to ask herself.
Okay.
Yes, hi, Jay, thank you. You mentioned, one of us could ask you, what is John Kerry most concerned about? So I guess I'll throw that in as well. I'm wondering if this committee or whatever you called it, that's going to now be looking at the loss and damage funds and what should be proposed at COP28. And they have to have their first meeting by March 31st, that group. Is there going to be transparency about what they're doing? Do you expect that we can watch what they're proposing along the way? And
Yes.
then a final question, just if it's okay, I just throw out here. If China agreed to the loss and damage fund, but also is wants to be considered a developing country, I'm wondering what agreement was made so that they signed on to that.
Yeah. So yes, the intention and written in the instructions to the forming transition committee is that they will have to be utterly transparent in every meeting. And they have less than a year now to put this together. And they're going to need some help going. And they're going to need some support from people like John Kerry, if he's still representing the US. Here's what Kerry said to me. So with Kerry, I have a chance so far every year that I've gone to the COP. I don't know why I've gotten so lucky to be in a small room with 12 people, including John Kerry or his predecessor. And this allows me to ask questions about how diplomacy works because I knew nothing about it before. But in the last 3 years, I have gotten, well, more than 3 years because it started in Paris when I was in Paris. And that was when I got in a room, a small room with John Kerry. And there were people from other countries there too, but there were no more than 12 there. And we got to know each other a little bit because we were there for an hour and there were 12 people there. And you know what? He always wanted to ask people good questions because he was trying to find out what was going on in places like Minnesota. And so when I went to Glasgow last year, I found out that he was on the agenda for a public meeting. And I did not know that I would be let into this meeting, but I got let in. It was at a different location in Scotland. It wasn't at the UN facility. And I didn't know how many people would be there. But I did what I do in Minnesota too. I found out if you want to be in the room, you should get there early. And I know what works in Minnesota, and it also worked in Glasgow because I was the first person there. I got my name tag. I went into the room. I counted how many chairs were there. And there was enough chairs for about 90 people. So I said, an audience of 90 is here. I saw the stage where John Kerry would be half an hour later. And I sat in the best seat in the front row. And I tested my phone. And, but I was wearing a mask. But would you believe it? I was alone in the room when John Kerry walked out on the stage. And he was just trying to see what his talking spot would be like. And I went right up to the edge of the stage. We touched elbows because that's the way people were greeting each other. And I said, "Do you remember me from Paris, J. Hamilton?" And I held up my very large badge and he read what it said and he said, "Tell me more about this meeting," because he couldn't really remember it. And I described when we were meeting in Paris, there were 12 people in the room. We were surrounded by plywood walls. And so there was so much loud, there were people protesting right outside against the plywood walls on the other side. And he said, "Oh yeah, I remember that. And I remember what you had to say about Minnesota." And I told him, and he said, "What's happening in Minnesota that's new?" And I couldn't believe we were alone in this room, that everyone was in the other room having coffee and a very sumptuous breakfast. But I was there talking to our lead negotiator. And we wound up having a conversation for about 40 minutes. And now bring yourself forward to Egypt. And I went to another meeting and John Kerry was there. And I went up and said hi to him. And I said, "Do you remember me from Glasgow?" And then he brought me, next door to him was an alcove. And outside the alcove were all of his staff. Well, some of he has a very large staff. They had about 4 staff waiting outside the alcove. And the alcove wasn't closed or anything like that. But he said, "I'd like to hear what's happening in Minnesota." So I spent like 10 minutes, and then I wanted to know what he was really concerned about at this COP. And he said a couple of things. He said, "My most important thing is to start bilateral discussions again with China." You know, you may have remembered how Speaker Pelosi went over there, near there, rose a lot of hackles. But John Kerry made that happen now. So bipartisan discussions have started. And he said, "What really concerns me is that China promised to bring to Egypt his plan for methane reductions." And so he is still working on that. And what was interesting from China is that China hasn't said yet, it's far from saying that it's going to be contributing to the loss and damage fund. But at another side meeting in Egypt, someone very senior from China said, "Yes, we're going to contribute to that." And he described something that sounded, what I would be surprised was not part of being funded by the loss and damage fund. So they at least made the first overture. And now what I think of the major importance of John Kerry is that he is very well respected by President Xi. Very well respected. They each refer to the other as "my very good friend," and they mean it. So it is very important to keep that working. And the other thing that Kerry knows about China is that China does not want to be called out by crowds of people. That's not the way they make better decisions. It's very smart diplomacy that gets them. He hasn't been able to get them to do everything he wants, but he's able to get remarkable changes in their policy. So that's why I like to talk to him, because he will talk to me and he knows I want to spread whatever I've heard from him to other people. And never has he asked me not to spread anything he's told him. And that's the way transparency works. And that's good. And what it means is I will tell you whatever he's told me. Because I want other people to know that there is good things being done by people of all ages and from all countries in this climate movement. You can bet you don't even know how many people are working on this. I know personally a lot of people have been working on it longer than I have. And that gives me more hope too.
Jay, we have several questions. Let's see. From Huron Smith, he's asking, you have a robust travel schedule. How do you finance your travel? Does an organization support you?
Yes, so I'm going to the COPs, for example, as the one delegate from Fresh Energy. And I've always tried every year to get a larger delegation, but I can't get more badges. And COPs are growing so fast that I didn't get any other badges. But I see myself as representing in some ways Minnesota, parts of Minnesota at least, and parts, I feel I would make myself very visually and audially an American. And I say to every group I speak to, and I speak to a lot of groups on the global stage, I say, I want to talk to you. I want to tell you what's happening, what's working in the US, what's not working. And I want to get your ideas from your country too. It doesn't take much money to go. It takes a plane ticket. And we have a donor who likes my work, and he likes to make it possible for me to go buy a plane ticket. And I share a hotel with other people, and food doesn't really cost very much. And fortunately, when we go to Dubai, Dubai has a really good metro system, which I'll be on all the time. So it'll be virtually free to go anywhere. But I think it's because I've built a credibility here in Minnesota that I am going to these COPs. But unlike some people who go to COPs, and some of them are college students from America, and I see them on WhatsApp, and they're always comparing notes. Where do you want to go get beer tonight? I'm not interested in that. I'm there trying to talk to the most responsible party to the US, which is John Kerry, and anyone else I can find from that administration that I can talk to, and then share the information back to Minnesota and let them know that we have their back in Minnesota because we are doing everything we possibly can to cut emissions. We've had some amazing successes, and let them know that we're going to continue that because we know that not any federal administration can work alone. They have to have a lot of supporters in every community and a lot of climate activists in every part of society, and that they're here. And part of what distinguishes me a little bit is that I always talk to a lot of people, and I always get great ideas from some of those amazing people.
Okay, so we have another question from Jack Levi. How will the recipients of the funds be rewarded or penalized based on their own initiatives regarding pollution, recycling, conservation efforts, etc.?
I don't know, and no one has ever brought up that specifically in my hearing. Probably people have. So I don't know if this transition committee will be examining it, but I think you were just the first person to bring that to my attention. I suspect because it is about asking parties to the treaty to come forward in Dubai and make a commitment to how much money their country will put into the loss and damage fund. It's a different kind of thing. So, and because I talked about consensus a lot before, so that's very important, how the UN conferences work. But also, no one from the UN can make any country do anything. So it is really smart diplomacy that gets countries, even like China, even like India, maybe eventually even Egypt, to switch some of their policies to be a lot less giveaways to fossil fuels. But it's going to take some things that can only happen in person. And that's why, you know, sometimes people ask me, well, how much carbon have you caused to be emitted by going to Egypt? And I said, I'm going to see what people can do in person. And I know that diplomacy would not happen if everyone were trying to do it on a Zoom like this. That the presidents of very important countries, both very important developing countries and very important rich countries, need to talk more. And as they talk, one of the diplomacy tricks that seems to work more often than not is for countries to be put out as not being against fossil fuels ever. A lot of countries feel embarrassed by being outed on that. And that means that if people are in a room with other diplomats who they happen to respect and know that millions of people are watching, on occasion, or maybe more often and more often, they make policy commitments that only they can really do back in their own countries. Because when everyone has to say whether they're doing enough or not to support the Paris Agreement, nobody is yet doing enough, nobody. But the question to them is really, what will your country do? And like everyone I've ever met at a climate conference, people from every country in the world know a lot of things about the US, and they know a lot about our political geography. So at my first COP meeting, they pulled me aside when they heard that I was from the US, and they said, can you have coffee with me? And they always wanted to say, you know, Jay, it doesn't really matter to us what the very left coast of California does on climate. And it really doesn't matter what the most progressive coast in New England does on climate. Because we know the decisions in America get made in Congress, or they don't. And we know the states they are most interested in. And recently they've started naming the same 4 states that Joe Biden has been talking about most: Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Illinois, with lots of Democrats in place of power and in very purple states. And all of those states are in the Midwest. And the Midwest, the 12 states of the Midwest, are the most emitting carbon states in the country. The Midwest is. And so it's not a country, it's a region. But if the Midwest 12 states, which have a lot of population, if they were a country, here's where they would rank with all of the top emitters in the world. They would rank 5th in the world, the Midwest. And that means that it would fall somewhere between Japan and Russia. And that is why I think John Kerry is interested in talking to me, partly because he knows I live in this very purple part of the country and a high carbon emitting part of the country. And he knows his boss, President Biden, is not getting what he's promised to the rest of the world, 50% reduction in emissions in less than 10 years by 2030. He knows he's looking ahead beyond 2030 because solving this climate thing means we're going to need to decarbonize everything we can. And that's going to take very hard work. So I'm glad we have that as our leading diplomat. He knows where we need to go. And he's always thinking, always 10 or 20 steps ahead.
Okay, so we are almost over with our time. So this one has to be the last one. This comes from Fred. How do the funding packages under discussion account for countries in the South Pacific that are forecasting being swallowed up by the sea? The World Bank's approved the 20 million package last year seems to fund protecting the island, yet the islands are still considered to be disappearing due to the rising sea levels. Can the islands really be protected with that, with what they can build with the funds that are being made available, or do the funds include moving to other countries and reestablishing new lives elsewhere?
Yeah, and you have to think about this as a disappearing in the distance, saving island nations. I don't know how they're going to work that out. But they're going to have to talk about what specific types of things would they be funding, and how can people on a disappearing island have the wherewithal to apply for that money. These are really hard questions. I don't think it's all going to be solved in the next year, but what we have to do is make a plan and and we need to really decide if there is a repository or a place or a network of places where that money is going to go. No, none of these decisions have been made, but I tell you what the UN has said. All right, let me put on my glasses and I'll read it to you and then I'll stop. They say that US dollars, $4 trillion per year needs to be invested in renewable energy up until 2050 to reach net zero emissions by 2050. That's a huge amount of money, US $4 trillion. A global transformation to a low carbon economy is expected to require the investment of at least $4 to $6 trillion per year. Some of that will be loss and damage, but there needs to be a lot more than that invested in renewable energy. Because remember, there's still over 1 billion people in the world who want to have electricity for the first time in their lives. So that is also going to be a very big demand. And we need to make sure that wherever possible, we do not do new investments in fossil fuels, that we switch to zero carbon fuels. And that's also a very big thing. So there's still much more discussion that needs to go on. It helps if more smart people like you find ways, and I will share with you when I know about this transition committee is meeting and where it posts its documents. And so you can go and look at yourself. And what I do occasionally, because I tend to be up at all hours when I want to listen in on a conversation that's going on in Europe. Sometimes I have to get up at an unearthly hour here, but it's been interesting to see how they work because they are really pretty transparent in their documents and in their meetings.
That's wonderful. Well, we had many more questions, so I will make sure that they are delivered to you, Jay, and so you are able to respond. And I apologize to everybody who didn't have their questions answered here, but we also wanted to make sure that we honor the audience's time. On behalf of CGS Minnesota, I want to thank you all for attending this event. If you want to watch again, the recording of this discussion can be found on our website and on our YouTube channel. The CGS Minnesota hosts events every month. Please check our website for updates. If you have any questions, please reach out to us at cgsmn.contact@gmail.com. Everything is going to be on our website and our YouTube channel. Contact me if you want to reach J. Drake Hamilton. I did put her email for her request in our chat, but I can give you again. Jay, on behalf of CGS Minnesota, thank you so very much for your wonderful presentation. Please do keep in touch. I will make sure that whatever you share with me, I will add to our video description on our website. Thank you so everybody for coming, and thank you, Jay, again. Hope to see you again soon.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.